Okay, we're recording. This is going to be a talk about the history of the origins and development of plastic tubing in the maple industry. I'm Matt Thomas, and I'm giving this talk, and it's kind of fun to give a talk like this to an industry group. And I'm assuming, because you guys and gals are in the room, is that you're the army of historians I'm going to recruit over time here to help spread the word and such. But we'll see. But it's really fun to talk to this kind of a group because I don't have to explain certain kinds of things about maple sugaring, and I'm not even going to talk that much really about how tubing itself changed the industry. Most of you guys probably are using tubing and know that kind of thing. So I'm going to talk more about where did it start? Who started it? Where did the ideas come from? And there's some interesting interaction amongst three particular men that are key part of this story. So as a historian, there's a lot of stories, and this isn't really ancient history as maple history goes. There's people that in the room that might even have known some of the folks I'm going to talk about, or certainly are only a generation removed from some of this. And there's lots of great memories, and I'm interested in hearing about any of them from people about this. But a big part of my work as a historian is going into other forms of evidence. So there's memories and there's oral histories, and those are great, but they also are fraught with certain inaccuracies and misremembrances and other things. So that's one piece of the pie, but going back and trying to find things that corroborate or contradict and multiple lines of evidence to back up these things are what I try to do, especially with this particular story, because there's things that people have told over time that are partly true, and I'm trying to tell the whole story and give other credit where credit is due, as the case may be. But of course, this is about the origins of plastic tubing, but there were other predecessors to plastic tubing. And I'll go through this fairly quickly because it's not the point of the whole talk. But 1794, for example, there was a wood style or wooden trough, much like this. It's not the greatest picture, I'm sorry, but imagine a V-shaped trough. Like that, made of long wood slats. These are about 10 feet long. And what happened in 1794, the Holland Land Company, which was a Dutch land company that had gotten a grant in New York, decided to go into maple operation big time. And they were doing it for a variety of reasons. One, to make some money from their land, but more importantly, they wanted to start a sugar industry in North America that wasn't based on slave sugar made in the Caribbean and other areas. And so they said, well, they knew that maple sugar could be made and was being made, and say that this guy, Garrett Boone, wanted to go in big time. And so he had a 17-acre sugar bush that they were going to experiment on, and he set up a huge had these long wooden slats made. Well, they warped and his were made with two pieces nailed together, which you can just imagine. It wasn't one long milled piece. You can imagine what happened right away. It warped, it leaked, it fell apart, it didn't work. And he wanted to try it again and improve. The people that were the real money managers for the company said, no, that was a mistake, we're not going to do it. And that was the end of that. So it happened one year, somebody tried a pipeline, and it wasn't from tree to tank, it was a conduit to go dump into and move it downhill with gravity. Then similar things were patented. For example, in 1863, Sheldon and Chase in Vermont here, they patented something well, theirs was one milled piece, but a very similar idea, just a conduit through the woods. And it wasn't really a significant use of such technology, but people were starting to say, hey, we can move sap through the woods better, let's try this. And then moving forward from that and expanding on that same kind of technology or same kind of thinking was tubular metal pipelines. And you see some of those even as early as the 1860s, late 1800s into the 20s, 30s, and even the 50s. Here's a couple of pictures of great examples of them where they had these funnels, and often called standpipe dumping stations, where they were still tapping, putting buckets on the trees, had to carry them to these long tubing systems that were pipeline systems that then carried it downhill with gravity to big tanks. This one, Horseshoe Forestry Company one, this was in the Adirondacks in 1897 to 1908, and he had 50,000 taps at that time, and 5 sugar houses with 5 evaporators in each sugar house. His own railroad system, and I won't go off on that because my second book, which I'm just about finished with, is all about the Horseshoe Forestry Company operation. Here's another example of similar type standpipe systems. So ideas were improving, materials were improving as folks thought about it. The next one folks are very familiar with in Vermont was taking it one level better, is the Brower sap piping system, aka the gooseneck system, which literally was a tubing system where it went from tap to connector to lateral to mainline to tank, or something, or right even to the sugar house sometimes. This was invented by William Brower, started messing with this in 1905 in Mayfield, New York, patented it in 1916, and it worked in a general sense. It had its drawbacks. It would freeze easily and not thaw out very quickly. It leaked. It would blow down. Trees would fall on it. Those kind of things. But the idea was, and it was expensive, so there was some deterrent to even anyone in the smaller size to really get into that. But what's important about it is that conceptually laying out how tubing would work in the woods with the gravity system like that. And even though he wouldn't have called them a drop line, the way those tubes actually worked, because they had a little bit of a drop. There's all these very strong similarities to how tubing eventually, plastic tubing, did develop. And so people had a pretty strong idea from this already. Here's some more pictures of that. If you're interested in this, come and talk to me later, because I've researched tons on this particular system and written about it and have lots more to tell, but I won't.
Now, Matt, that's all metal, right?
It's all metal. In fact, one of the other issues why it got people stopped using it is that it's turnplate coated metal, and that's lead heavy, and that was a big issue. People were starting to become more and more aware of the concerns with that. But it's all metal. It's sheet metal, so these are rolled sheet and folded sheet. This is also rolled, but then this has got a solder, and then it fits into this hole, and you twist it in, and it locks in with these little pins. It's pretty amazing.
What was the date for that type?
So it was patented and started to be marketed in 1916, and then the Carey Company, back to the Carey Company, they were very interested in it and very, very supportive of using it and promoted it, and brought William Brower from Mayfield, Vermont, or Mayfield, New York, to St. Johnsbury, and they started manufacturing it in St. Johnsbury and helped market it and promote it as well. And he Carey partly owned that business then for a while. That stopped in the mid-20s, the production, but people continue to use it, into the 30s. And there's a family in New York that is on the property where it was invented that I actually spent a weekend sugaring with, and they continued to make it into the 90s, and not for sale, but personal use into the 2000s. I'm not so sure. I feel okay as far as the lead, but I'm not so sure about that now. But all right, so then the next, logical step and important things that happened in the transition is improvement in materials. So we had this great tubing network idea laid out with the Brower system. And then post World War II, the plastics era really took off, and so there were new opportunities with new materials. And this George H. Soule company came out with Everett I. Soule invented and patented this the King Sat Bag. It's made from what they call vinyl light material. It was this thick, heavy, and maybe folks have seen these heavy-duty bags that were meant to be washed and reused. It first went for sale in 1951, and it was, it was moderately successful. It would sometimes, if they're too full, and they'd freeze and they'd blow out, things like that. They weren't the easiest thing to clean. They'd get brittle because it was early plastics as well. They'd get brittle over time and things like that. But it was another part of it that's really interesting is that conceptually, it was a really big change for people to start seeing these hanging on trees, and that was, good as far as being a transition to people start thinking about plastic tubing in the woods, because that's a real shocker for people to start accepting as well. So now we're to the point of talking about flexible plastic tubing. These are the three people I'm going to talk about. Nelson Griggs, folks have probably heard of him. George Breen, folks maybe or maybe not have heard of him, and Bob Lamb, which almost everybody's heard of because of Lamb tubing persisted for so long. They're the three guys that are the key to this story. We'll start with Nelson Griggs because he is the one that's most often credited with inventing flexible plastic tubing because he earned a patent on it first. But I'll come back to whether or not that's exactly the case or not. Let's see. So Griggs was an MIT educated engineer. He was not a sugar maker. He was in Montpelier working for the state as a highway engineer, and also worked through an organization called the Bureau of Industrial Research, which I don't think exists anymore, but it was a state-funded organization to help bring experts and engineers together with industry to help provide research and ideas for improving industry in the state. And through that, they got some money to do some research and do some experimenting with his idea about plastic tubing. Now it's interesting because we don't exactly know where he got his idea. He was friends with Harry Morse at Morse Sugar Works in East Montpelier, and we know they were friends and they may have talked about some things. We know he was in good contact with the folks at the Proctor Maple Research Farm, as it was called then, but we don't really know exactly where he got the idea, and there's some other things that I'm going to talk about a little bit about that. But regardless, in 1955, they had this research grant, and they started this project he developed his own model of tubing, his own design, and they tested it at the Proctor Maple Research Farm. And then going through the notes and things at the Proctor archives, they talk about he was the leader of this maple experiment, and here's a picture of from 1955. This is Griggs in the middle, and some faces may look familiar of folks at Proctor at the time. And this was just one of the days tapping and running the lines and testing. And it wasn't an extensive test initially. He used what is called a food tubing, and it was 1/4 inch extruded polyvinyl chloride tubing, and he created what he called a bushing style spout, and it was made from this tubular aluminum and this hard plastic that was kind of put together to hold the pieces together, and then the flexible tubing was attached to that. It was a closed system from the beginning, and then it was laid down onto the ground, and so it had a sort of a natural drop line to it, but they weren't necessarily thinking in terms of drop lines like people think today. And it went into 7/16 drilled holes. Right away, the system was shown to be, and then they would hang it on trees with buckets and open air spouts and everything right next to it to compare its capabilities. And it was shown right away to be more productive than pails were, possibly for a variety of reasons. It created a closed air vacuum. It was a cleaner system because it was closed off from access to microbial growth as quickly and things like that. So feeling confident in his design, until he tested it in 55, and he submitted his patent in February 1956, and then he got to work doing some mass production. We don't know exactly how much, but there were a few people who started to install it in 1957 in Vermont, but he didn't really commercially, you never see commercial, booklets or anything selling this, but people did put some up. In fact, there's a Burlington Free Press article for a sugar maker named Guy Page of Waterville, who he put up 400 taps as part of his 4,000 tap operation with this Griggs system. And he was quoted as saying it's one of the advantages of it was that you can, quote, set up your pipes in February, you go down to your house and drink beer till the sap runs out, and then all you have to do is boil it. Not sure it's that simple, but... So he submitted his patent application in 56, and he was awarded his patent in 1959, but not without some controversy. Which then moves us into George Breen from Jamaica, Vermont. So George Breen also didn't have a background in maple sugaring. He was an engineer, but what's interesting about him, so he got involved with this, started using tubing in 1953, and if you recall, I said 1955 for Nelson Griggs' first experiment at Proctor. That's an interesting comparison of that time frame. George Breen, and I don't know if anybody knows Sean Breen. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? He's a sugar maker from Jeffersonville area and the son of George. George Breen and his wife in 1952, they purchased the farm of Helen and Scott Nearing. And that name may ring a bell to people. The Maple Sugar Book written by them. It's also a famous farm as far as some of the back to the lander farm movement goes. Anyway, he was interested in getting out of the city and going to the farm, and so he contacted the Nearings, just asking about farms for sale, and they had another plan. They wanted to sell their farm because they wanted to move to Maine. And so, in a long story short, the Breens purchased the Nearings farm in Jamaica, and in 1952 they tapped the sugar bush there for the first time for the Breens. The Nearings have been doing it for years, and he quickly realized that there's got to be a better way than hauling pails. And the next year, 1953, from the beginning of the season, he ordered 400 feet of blood transfusion tubing from 3M. And he just attached that to existing metal spouts, and he liked what he found, and so he quickly ordered another 1,000 feet and developed his own experimental spouts that he had made at a local machine shop, and got to town and was kind of figuring things out himself. One of the things he did was, as an engineer by training, he had put a pressure gauge on one of the taps, and he discovered that there was some pretty significant pressure coming out of the tree at as much as 35 pounds he was finding. And he contacted Jim Marvin and said, "Hey, did you know this?" And Jim Marvin said, "Yeah, we know that. That was known then. The trees had pressure." But George says, "But you can make that work. You can make that move sap. That was that's what's important about it." And Mr. Marvin kind of said, "Oh, okay, whatever," and didn't really do much with it, at least initially. Breen continued and purchased more of this blood transfusion tubing, and eventually the folks at 3M said, "What is going on in the woods in Jamaica that you need all this blood transfusion tubing?" And he says, "I'm not telling." And the reason for that was in 1954, so 53 he starts tapping, he contacts Jim Marvin. Well, Jim Marvin told Nelson Griggs, the previous guy, about this tubing activity. And Griggs showed up and wanted to see what he was doing in 1954. And he didn't say get out of here or anything, he just showed him, and Griggs commented, and this is from George Breen's memoirs, Griggs commented that, "Yeah, I've been thinking about something similar, but we don't have any evidence that Griggs had done anything at that point." And so George Breen, not wanting to spill the beans when the 3M folks called, says, "I'm not telling you what we're doing." Well, later that season, or in 1955, I should say, when they contacted him, he's out in the sugar bush, and all of a sudden this 3M guy comes on snowshoes, going through the woods in a three-piece wool suit, and so one of the vice presidents from 3M, and said, "All right, I see what you're doing now." And they quickly, got going together, and the 3M guy said, let's work this into a real viable thing. We'll put our people on it. We'll work together on the design. And they started a partnership, which became what 3M called Maple Flow. And the guy's name was Irwin Brown, at the vice president at 3M. So Maple Flow, then what they developed was first commercially available, sold in the fall of 1957 for the 1958 sugaring season. And so the terms of the partnership that George Breen and 3M agreed to, one of the things they had him do was travel around the state and promote it and sell the idea to people. But he also got a cut of the sale. So in the beginning, they rewarded him with 5% commission on sales. Well, soon after, when sales reached 500,000 units, which sold at $1 each, they said, let's renegotiate, and they gave him a $25,000 lump sum. And at that point, it had been advertised well enough, and Leader was starting to sell it, and George Soule was starting to sell it for them. 3M didn't actually sell it. You couldn't order it from 3M. You had to buy it through Leader or Soule or Canadian Seller, and then eventually some other Western folks were selling it for them. But they didn't submit their patent right away. It was 1957 that they submitted their patent application. Then they did a modification, and eventually they got their patent in '62. And I know these are a lot of dates, but what's interesting is the timing on when they submitted their patent and their revised one relative to Nelson Griggs's, because they felt that Nelson Griggs had stolen their idea. And 3M being pretty powerful and having patent attorneys and some corporate muscle, they told Breen, they said, "We think we can prove that you would be infringing on our patent idea, and so we'll give you this settlement of $5,000 if you agree not to push a patent issue and you don't involve yourself with maple tubing anymore."
Back to Griggs.
To Griggs, yeah. So not to Breen, to Griggs. Thank you. And he took it because he really wasn't, in the maple business, and it was kind of a side thing for him. He hadn't really had a backer like this to go for it, and so that was the last you really ever heard of Nelson Griggs's tubing. It didn't, and it wasn't as elegant of a system either. And so Maple Flow was for sale in '58 and was pushed for many years, and 3M continued to make it into the early '80s, and then they pretty much got out of it. It was such a minor thing in their bigger scheme of products. And then, as I'll come to next, Lamb came on the scene hard, and he really took the industry tubing thing in another direction.
Was the polyvinyl chloride that Griggs was using like a similar rigidity to today's PVC, or was it?
I don't know as far as the formula goes. Like Griggs had metal tubes with these little plastic pieces that held it together. So whereas this one was these all hard plastics, and then the flexible tubing, and these are, so you've probably seen these red fittings maybe in places in museums, or maybe somebody still has some hanging around in a collection. And they had all the fittings and the tube and the spiles. And one of the things that's interesting is you see these little loops here. So the tubing where the sap flow went through here, it also had these little loop things, which were not for sap flow, but so you could adjust the tension on the tubing because it wrapped around the tree. And this was a closed system, and a raised system. It didn't go sit on the ground like the Griggs system did. So you had to suspend it like you see in the picture there, and add lateral lines and add main lines. The black and what would have been clear tubing was an interesting thing. That was an idea. The black striping was an idea of George Breen's wife to add a little heat so that the tubing wouldn't freeze. Well, it worked too well sometimes, and it heated up the tubing too much, and would lead to faster microbial growth. But they were trying different ideas and things like that. So next in the lineup then is Bob Lamb, Robert Lamb, he was in different places at different times, Bernards Bay, Liverpool, New York. Folks have seen probably different names associated with him. So Lamb is really interesting too because he wasn't a maple guy either. He was, and he wasn't, I don't know if he had an engineering degree, I don't believe he did. He was a chainsaw salesman and a marine engine salesman and repair guy in New York. So he was connected with the logging industry with his chainsaws, and there's Lamb chainsaws. He and his brother and his father actually developed some of their own chainsaws, early chainsaws, which are really neat in a totally anecdotal way. But the way he got into this, according to Fred Winch, who was a Cornell maple expert specialist, and it took me a long time to find out how did the Lamb story start, because I would ask people and they're like, I don't really know, or did he have a sugar bush? Well, I don't really know. And it was kind of a weird mystery. And I finally found an accounting from this where he said that Cornell University Extension forester named Dick Howard was off working with some of the folks in his territory, and he saw a sugar maker named Leon Wright from Cattaraugus County using the not flexible tubing, but the stiff pipe tubing connected from taps to buckets. And it was really awkward, and it really wasn't working very well. But that got this Dick Howard thinking, and Dick Howard thought, well, I know somebody who's got a creative mind who might be able to come up with a better way to do this. And so he brought that idea and came to Bob Lamb, and they said, sure, let's work on that, which they did. And they developed, and these are from the Krogan Maple Museum, which Bob Lamb helped start by donating money to buy the building, and he has lots of his old stuff is still in there. This was his early prototype system. And so it was in 1955 that Dick Howard came to Bob Lamb. So just looking at all this was happening at exactly the same time, and which is really fascinating. So those guys in 1956, they set this up for one of the New York Maple Tours. So it wasn't extensive, but they got a viable operating system together. And Bob Lamb was always tinkering, always trying to improve stuff. And so he kept plugging away. 1957, fall of 1957, he is marketing his for sale in the 1958 sugaring season, which is the same timeline as the Maple Flow system. So initially, the first year, it was called Lamb's Plastic Tubing System for Gathering Maple Sap. That's kind of a mouthful. The next year, 1959, he started calling it Natural Flow, which is really interesting because you've got Maple Flow, Natural Flow. Coincidence? I don't think so. The Lamb Company, it was initially Bob Lamb and his brother who had the bigger company, and this was just a side thing, getting into the maple side of it and equipment and developing tubing, but it was very successful, and Bob put a lot of time into it right away, and they decided to split the company out. So Bob Lamb and Florence Lamb took the maple side, and his brother Curtis stayed with the marine engine and chainsaw side of things. Bob did it. He didn't patent his, even though he had invented it and was selling it. He didn't submit his patent and get it patented anywhere near in the same timeline as the other two gentlemen, which suggests there was not any of this patent competition or infringement issues. He just managed to stay out of it and do his own thing, yet he was producing a commercially sold product just at the same time as the 3M product. What's different about this was it was an open system, so it was vented, and Bob Lamb strongly believed that it had to be a vented system. And one of the interesting things about reading about Bob Lamb is he had a lot of comments and strong opinions, and he expressed them in Maple Digest with ads. And sometimes they were articles, but he would take out ads, and he was very good at marketing and sales. He was also very good at not being afraid to spend money on the industry. He was a serious promoter of the industry and a great friend to it. But he also took advantage of promoting his products as well. But he was until the research was so irrefutable, he was strongly saying you had to have a vented system. You had to have a vented system. His was also a ground system initially for many years, and he had these long drop lines. But once they saw the merit of raising the system, which really happened when they came around to understand that you didn't have to take these down and wash them every year, which is what they did in the beginning. Everything was taken down, washed, put away, hung back up. You can just imagine what that would be like, and people just thinking this is not really a labor-saving device in a lot of ways. But he came around and he improved his system over time. And he had his own extruder. He made his own tubing at his place in New York. And it's like a long shed that they built this thing in. If you've ever seen how extruders work, and they're not small devices. And he would be constantly tinkering and redesigning and coming up with new little fittings and spiles. And I don't know if anyone has ever seen a complete collection of Lamb stuff because there's so many little pieces. Some I think are just experimental. But these weren't the only guys. There were other people that we don't know very much about who didn't patent anything and didn't commercially develop anything, but we can find newspaper stories and other things discussing these guys. So, a guy named Chester Wilson in Wisconsin, he was reported to be using tubing as early as 1952. And in 1955, he had 400 trees on tubing. And I was able to actually contact the old county forester who helped set up some of his sugar bushes. And he remembers Chester, Chester didn't do it to create a new thing. He just wanted to make it work better for himself, and it was never turned into any kind of a commercial endeavor or anything further. Similar guy named Basil Hummer in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Basil Hummer, he was tubing as early as 1955. He had 7,000 feet of tubing in 1956. Again, didn't really become something bigger, but the idea was taking foot, and people were really interested in what could this new plastic technology do for them. Another guy, George Butler, Jacksonville, he had 3,000 taps on what was called surgical plastic tubing, probably similar to the blood transfusion stuff, and he invented his own tap to go with it. He gave it up. He said it wasn't saving him. By 1960, he bailed on it, and it wasn't saving him any time. And again, things were leaked. The fittings weren't that tight, and they were still learning how to do it. And so he said, "I'm not really getting anything out of this labor-wise. So I think it's not really a great system. He should have waited a little longer." I think he might have had a different opinion. And then Everett Sewell, he patented another similar system with tubing and fittings, but the Sewell company never went forward with producing that. And or I couldn't find anything in talking to the descendants of the family that it actually was even ever installed on the Sewell sugar bush. It was more conceptual, I think.
Was he George's brother?
No, Everett was his nephew.
Okay.
George had no kids, and so this was Everett Sewell, and his brother took over the company when George Sewell passed away. And the farm is owned by went to a niece, and that's still in that family, and they still sugar there as well, which is another interesting story. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell. So there was these three guys that were interacting with each other in some ways, and they were also, what was really, what I didn't also mention is with the George Breen's Maple Flow system, the 3M system, that was tested at Proctor Maple Research Center in 59, 60, and 61. So they were, Proctor, not surprisingly, was right on board helping with testing and improving this stuff. Lamb's was also right there at the very beginning, not 59, but 60, 61, 62. And then they started testing these two systems side by side, because the Nelson Griggs one just disappeared and didn't really become as I told you, wasn't supposed to become a system anymore, because he signed this agreement. A fascinating thing about that, I tried through many avenues to try to get access if there were any kind of records from 3M about that, and to verify this, because I got the stories about that from George Breen, and I got it from Nelson Griggs' daughter. So I was able to, it wasn't just coming from one place. They both corroborated in different aspects of that story. But I really wanted to see if there was a file or a record related to this, and I wasn't able to get any traction. They were not interested in talking to me even. But it's really interesting to me that how these early things developed. These weren't sugar makers. These were engineers. These people that understood and were interested in the questions and the problems of maple. And then they partnered with organizations like with the Cornell Forester and with 3M and with Proctor and so these things never. I guess the moral of the story is this: these things come from interesting different places, and they never come in a vacuum. There's never really one simple answer, one guy or one thing. It takes partnerships, and it takes cross-pollination and things like that. So that's the story in a nutshell. There's other things that I didn't even go into, which is the origins of vacuum, which came on the heels of this. That's another story. Maybe next year I'll be back or something. I don't know, because that's another one I'm researching, and that's interesting because there's a whole Canadian side to that. This all tubing there's Canadian tubing made very soon after, but they can't claim the invention of it like the Vermont or New Yorkers. A vacuum's a different story. That's an interesting, complicated thing. And then there's other things also that fit into that bigger story, like her formaldehyde tablets, which I've written about. I have a website called maplesyruphistory.com, and I publish short little articles and other things. You can go to that and learn more about that and other things that I've got coming up down the pike. And that's the talk for now. Questions, anyone? Yes?
Matt, when do you feel about what time period that tubing became commercially mainstream?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because this is all in
Right. This is just how it got started. And even though there was commercially, right. So it wasn't until vacuum, really. And I would say, and the vacuum part is an interesting question or an interesting part of it, because in Canada, the Canadian government put forth a subsidized program that you could convert from buckets to tubing and vacuum at a reduced price that they were underwriting. And so there was massive turnover, and that was in the 70s.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and that created a lot of volume as well. And there was some really good years, and there was a lot of syrup that was made then. And so I would think that you could say by 1980 in Canada and maybe 1985 in the United States that people. Even then, there was still some lag time, and because it was expensive, and it took some convincing to change over, and operators really weren't that big still then. So
10,000 taps.
Right.
Big operation.
Yeah, but it took vacuum to really bring that to the next level and even make it truly viable. I mean, this was also, I should emphasize, this was also a gravity system. It created its own natural vacuum, but it was still a gravity system, and so it really didn't work that well in some, non-New England, non-New York environments. Wisconsin, for example, the Reynolds Sugar Bush, which was a very big operation, they were tapping well over 100,000 trees in the late 60s and 70s. They tried to, but it was their land. If you've ever been where they were, it's very, very, very flat, and they couldn't. They just said tubing's not going to work for us because there wasn't a vacuum yet.
Can you comment a little bit about the drop line and where that fits into the story?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done enough research on the specifics of who really locked that idea in, because again, the lamb setup wasn't with the drop line function in mind. They kind of realized how that these drop lines serve this purpose of getting, not letting sap flow back and also keeping the tap cleaner and other things like that. And so it was kind of almost an accidental result of the design. And then they started to understand a little bit more about that. And that also fit into the learning more and more about vacuum. But I can't give you a really solid answer, what year, what research report really nailed that down. But I would say it would have been about 65, but yeah.
Two short ones. If you had to give a yes or no on if you actually believe Griggs did infringe on somebody else's idea, I know.
Yeah.
You have a question?
He asked, yes or no, do I think Griggs actually infringed on the 3M George Breen idea? Yes and no. But again, it's like I said, unfortunately, we don't have great evidence, and so an absence of evidence is difficult to give a really strong answer on. When did Griggs and how did Griggs get his idea? Did he and Harry Morse sit around talking about this, in 1952, and it wasn't until 1954, or that he started fiddling with it. The fact that he went to go to Breen's property, he had already had it in his mind. If he hadn't actually attempted it yet, we just don't know that. But the Breen and 3M folks, they could at least, they had things to show if there had to be a judge to convince. So was it significant? To be honest, the Breen design is nowhere near as good as the 3M design, and 3M obviously had designers and other people to put to that as well. But what was your second question?
I guess I missed how the nearings were connected.
Oh, so there's a famous book called the Maple Sugar Book.
Yeah, but that kind of predated a lot of the tubing system.
So that book came out in 1950, but they had a pipeline. They had a tubular pipeline system. But they came into it, I mean, the biggest significance for them is that George Breen bought their farm. And so he saw the pipeline system on their farm. And just also anecdotally, they're historically interesting to the maple world in Vermont history. But as far as actually their having anything to do with the tubing, other than the fact that they had a pipeline that Breen saw for moving sap downhill, no.
The maple syrup book didn't have anything about tubing in it.
It has their pipeline. Talks about their pipeline as a more efficient way to do that. Yeah.
They made it work very well with 1-inch cast iron pipe on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I actually ran a dumping station pipeline for a number of years for 1,200 taps, and of course using plastic, and it was suspended just like a regular tubing system, but we just had the main line.
Just the main line? Yeah.
It worked great.
It'd be interesting if you had a network with the rigid. That'd be.
Your buckets, your sap pails 50 to 75 feet to a dumping station.
Yeah.
I tried to keep the distances 75 feet.
Yeah, and that's a good way. For example, I don't know how many actual pipes that the Nearings had. The Horseshoe Forestry guy, he had many pipes because it covered a large area, and and he had these 5 different.
We had 4 main lines that came down to 1.5 inch main line, and then into the sugar house.
How many dump stations did you have?
Oh, geez,
Or- and how,
I
like-
remember 15
Uh-huh.
or, I don't know, close to 20 for 1,000 taps. So I tried to keep the distances under 75 feet,
Right.
because, you know, that, in the forest, 75 feet is a long way.
That's a long way to haul sap.
You know, in March, when it's raining and 34 degrees, and the
Right.
snow is just all mashed potatoes.
Exactly. Any other questions?
I've heard how a lot of tin pipeline was found with maybe 5-6 inches under the farmlands up in Franklin County, all over the place a lot. And I always thought, you know, they didn't use it, it wasn't as good, but I thought they would have dropped it down, but it was probably already all on the ground collecting.
Well, it was an elevated system. You suspended it on these wire, on like almost like telegraph wire, heavy wire that you had to string through the woods.
So
I mean, it had to be pretty straight because, you know, you didn't want lags and you didn't want low spots, and that was always a problem as well. So I don't know, it wasn't designed to go on the ground, and if people did put it on the ground, they had to be pretty careful in how they laid it out. But it's interesting that, you know, abandonment, if they just said, you know, fudge it, we're done, and we're just going to leave this out here. I mean, I have found it actually in Wisconsin. I used to be an archaeologist for the National Forest there, and they had a site we found that was used the Brower metal tubing, and it was an abandoned sugar house and everything, but all of that was stacked up inside. So the sugar house had all rotted away, but we found this giant, nicely stacked, you know, pile of the tubing in Wisconsin, in an area that, and we know from the research on that property that they would have been doing that sugaring in the 20s and early 30s, which is kind of later in some ways than I expected for that, you know, that tubing. But to see it just abandoned, like it was, you know, forgotten out in the woods, is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Memorial County Sugar House at the Fair and Field Days up in North Hyde Park has in the antique museum section, they have a section of that metal tube. And pictures of it running through the woods. And not unlike the wooden troughs, as the sun would hit it or not hit it, the metal would also bend and twist.
Right.
And the seams would come.
And that was right. It would pull apart because it's so long, and as metal expands and contracts, and we have extremes.
If you're over at Field Days here, go into the sugar house in the museum part, and you can see that right in the display. It's really neat.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to make syrup with that system in 2003 in Mayfield, New York. This family named Lent still set it up, and so I got to, you know, see it in operation in the woods, and again, I'm okay. I think I had the syrup made from there, took some home, but they still do it kind of as almost to honor the legacy of it, and it was really fun to learn. And I interviewed the grandson of William Brower, about just sort of how did this all happen, and so there's lots of great history to dig into on all the different aspects of this. So yeah.
You talk about abandonment. Maybe you might not find the old metal tubing, but you got to watch for the wire that they put it up
Yeah.
with, because that will be grown into the tree. And if
Yeah.
you
Absolutely.
happen to cut one up, you may catch a wire.
Yep. Yeah, and George, I mentioned not to talk too much about the metal tubing system, although it's interesting, but George Carey, he installed 15,000 taps of that tubing system on his sugar bush in North Danville, and he's a strong believer in it. And he made a film, which I've written about elsewhere. In 1927, he filmed it in that sugar bush. And one of the parts of the film that's interesting is he filmed different eras of the technology of sugaring, from the old, New England Yankee guy with the wood pails on the yoke, up to metal pails, and then this tubing system. And he was strongly in favor of it and promoting it. And as I said, he brought William Brower to St. Johnsbury, and they manufactured it there for commercial sale. I don't know, I never found records on how much they sold, but they sold a lot. I mean, if you go, everybody that collects taps has the Brower, an example of the Brower system, and there were probably a few 100,000 of those made. I mean, there were a lot made. People embraced it. All right, thank you. Glad you came.